The millionaire saw a poor little girl waiting for the job interview. What happened next is shocking. The morning sun had barely crested over the skyline when 8-year-old Alice Turner's worn sneakers, 2 sizes too small and held together with duct tape, touched the polished marble steps of the Churchill departmental store. She had been walking for 25 minutes. 25 minutes through neighborhoods that shifted from broken sidewalks to manicured lawns, from boarded windows to pristine storefronts. Her breath came in small, nervous puffs that created tiny clouds in the crisp October air. She clutched a folded newspaper in one hand and a wrinkled envelope in the other. The envelope contained her mother's job application, and Alice had promised with her whole heart, that she would deliver it. That she would speak for her mama who couldn't walk, couldn't stand, could barely whisper through the pain. Alice's purple jacket, faded from too many washes and patched at the elbows, hung loose on her tiny frame. Her hair was pulled back in 2 uneven ponytails, secured with rubber bands because the pretty hair ties had broken months ago. She looked up at the building. It stretched so high she had to crane her neck until it hurt, and for a moment, just a moment, she almost turned around. But Mama needed this job. Mama needed it more than air. The store was still locked. More than 30 candidates had already gathered outside, clustered in groups along the entrance, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement as they shifted impatiently. They stood in designer suits and tailored dresses, clutching leather portfolios, checking expensive watches, their confidence filling the space like expensive perfume. A woman in a cream-colored suit, her lips painted the color of wine, leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something behind a perfectly manicured hand. The man's expensive watch caught the light as he smirked, shaking his head. Their soft laughter carried through the morning air like a knife, cultured and cruel, cutting through the murmur of polite conversation. Alice heard them. Of course she heard them. But she had heard worse. She had heard the doctor at the free clinic tell her mama that without proper treatment, without real medicine, the infection might spread. She had heard her mama crying in the night when she thought Alice was asleep, whispering prayers to a husband who had died too young and left them with nothing but love and memories. So Alice walked away from the crowd, past the polished shoes and designer handbags, and found a corner along the building's exterior wall. She sat down on the cold concrete, tucked her legs beneath her, placed the envelope in her lap, and bowed her head. She had no idea that in exactly 12 minutes, a millionaire would walk through those doors. She had no idea that he was the reason her mama couldn't walk. And she had no idea that her courage on this cold October morning would change 3 lives forever. Before we proceed, permit me to welcome you, my lovely family, to another heartwarming story. If you're new here, we wholeheartedly welcome you. To cement your place in this community, please hit the subscribe button now. Don't also forget to hit the notification icon bell to ensure you are the first to see our new story tomorrow. Alice had arrived early, but clearly not early enough. The crowd had already formed, a sea of pressed fabrics and practiced smiles, of resumes that listed universities Alice had only seen on television and experience measured in years she hadn't even lived yet. She recognized the energy immediately. It was the same energy she felt in the free clinic waiting room, the desperate hunger for something better, though here it wore expensive cologne and carried itself with the arrogance that came from never having truly needed anything. From her corner along the cold exterior wall, Alice watched them. She watched how they stood, shoulders back, chins lifted, as if the very air around them confirmed their worthiness. She watched how they networked, exchanging business cards with the fluid grace of a rehearsed dance, laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny, compliments that probably weren't sincere. This was a world that operated on rules Alice didn't know, a language she hadn't been taught. The woman in the cream suit, Alice would later learn her name was Victoria Hastings, had positioned herself closest to the entrance. Her heels were the color of blood, sharp and clicking with authority every time she adjusted her stance. She held a leather portfolio that probably cost more than 3 months of Alice's mother's old salary, back when Mama could still work, back before the accident that had stolen everything. The man beside Victoria, Gregory something or other, checked his watch for the 4th time in as many minutes. It was gold, catching the morning sun like a small fire on his wrist. He had the kind of face that looked perpetually disappointed, as if the world kept failing to meet his standards. When his eyes swept across the crowd and landed on Alice, they didn't just pass over her, they dismissed her, erased her as if she were merely a smudge on the pristine morning. But Alice was used to being invisible. In many ways, she preferred it. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant people didn't ask questions about why she wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, why her shoes were too small, why she sometimes fell asleep in class because she'd been up all night helping Mama to the bathroom, changing the bandages on a wound that refused to heal. She pulled the envelope from her jacket pocket and read her mother's handwriting for the 100th time. The application was meticulous, every letter perfectly formed despite the pain Mary must have been in when she wrote it. Her qualifications were impressive: 10 years of retail management experience, expertise in inventory systems, customer service awards from her previous positions. Mary Turner was overqualified for this job, and they both knew it. But beggars couldn't be choosers, and they were beyond begging now. They were drowning. 3 nights ago, everything had changed. Alice had been asleep when she heard the sound, a thud against their apartment door, heavy and wrong. She'd found her mother collapsed in the hallway, her leg twisted at an angle that made Alice's stomach turn, blood soaking through her work pants. Mama had been walking home from her evening shift at the grocery store. She'd spent her last $12 on food for Alice's school lunch that week, which meant no bus fare, which meant walking the 3 miles home in the dark. The car had come out of nowhere, Mama said. Black and expensive and moving too fast down a street where children played and old people walked their dogs. It had hit her at the crosswalk, sent her spinning like a broken toy, and then it had disappeared into the night, red taillights fading like dying stars. Mr. Johnson, the 72-year-old delivery man from the next building over, had been the one to find her. He'd heard her crying, had somehow managed to get her to his old truck, had driven her to the only place still open, the small medicine shop run by Mrs. Chen 3 blocks from their apartment. Mrs. Chen had done what she could with antiseptic and bandages and prayers, but everyone knew it wasn't enough. Infections didn't care about prayers. Injuries didn't wait for paychecks. For 3 days, Mary had been getting worse. The wound festered despite Mrs. Chen's best efforts. The fever came in waves, turning Mama's skin hot enough to burn when Alice touched her forehead with a cool cloth. This morning, Mama couldn't even lift her head from the pillow. She'd whispered the words that sent Alice on this journey. Go, baby. Tell them Mama will come as soon as she can walk. Tell them Mama is the best worker they'll ever hire. Promise me you'll try. So Alice had tried. She'd woken before dawn, dressed in her least worn clothes, practiced what she would say. She'd checked on Mama one last time, left a glass of water within reach, and walked the 25 minutes through neighborhoods that reminded her exactly how far they'd fallen. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone had spotted movement inside the store, shadows shifting behind the frosted glass doors. The candidates straightened like soldiers called to attention, smoothing already smooth jackets, checking already perfect hair. Victoria Hastings moved even closer to the door, claiming her territory, her expression set in the kind of determination that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted. Alice remained in her corner, head still bowed, the envelope clutched in both hands now. She thought about Mama lying in that bed, thought about the way the fever made her talk to Daddy sometimes, speaking to a man who'd been dead for 4 years as if he were sitting right beside her. She thought about the medical bills they couldn't pay, the rent that was already 2 months overdue, the eviction notice taped to their door that Alice had hidden before Mama could see it. This job was their last chance. Their only chance. Alice didn't know if 8-year-olds were allowed to pray for selfish things, but she prayed anyway. She prayed that whoever opened those doors would have a heart big enough to see past her size, her clothes, her age. She prayed that somehow, impossibly, her mother's words through her small voice would be enough. What Alice couldn't know, sitting there on the cold concrete with her head bowed and her hope hanging by a thread, was that the man who was about to open those doors carried a guilt that had been eating him alive for 3 days. A guilt that would recognize her the moment he saw her. A guilt that would transform into something resembling grace. The lock clicked. The door began to open, and Alice's world was about to change forever. Alexander Churchill had not slept in 3 days. Not really. Brief moments of unconsciousness maybe, collapsing into bed only to jerk awake an hour later with the image burned into his mind, the woman's face in his headlights, her body hitting the pavement, the sickening thud that echoed in his chest like a second heartbeat. His driver, Marcus, had panicked, had pressed the accelerator instead of the brake, had kept driving while Alexander sat frozen in the back seat, his phone in his hand, 911 on the screen, his finger hovering over the call button for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. And then they'd turned the corner and the moment passed and Marcus was apologizing, saying she'd come out of nowhere, saying she was probably fine, saying they couldn't stop because it would ruin everything, the store opening, the reputation, the empire Alexander had spent 20 years building. And Alexander, God help him, had said nothing, had simply put his phone away and watched the city lights blur past his window while somewhere behind them a woman lay bleeding on the street. For 3 days, he tried to convince himself Marcus was right, that she was fine, that it hadn't been that bad, that his driver had overreacted but that stopping would have created complications they didn't need. For 3 days, he'd thrown himself into preparations for this store opening, the crown jewel of his expansion into community retail, the project that was supposed to prove Alexander Churchill cared about more than profit. The irony tasted like poison in his mouth. He'd fired Marcus yesterday. Not for hitting the woman, though that was reason enough, but for lying. Alexander had finally broken down and sent someone to check the hospitals, the clinics, anywhere a hit-and-run victim might have gone. They'd found nothing. No police reports. No hospital admissions. Which meant either Marcus had been right and she was fine, or she was somewhere the system didn't reach, somewhere people went when they had no insurance and no options and no hope. That possibility kept Alexander awake at night, staring at his ceiling in a penthouse that suddenly felt like a prison. Now, stepping out of his car at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before the scheduled interview's start time, Alexander Churchill looked every inch the self-made millionaire the newspapers loved to profile. His suit was Italian, charcoal gray, and perfectly tailored. His shoes were English leather, polished to a mirror shine. His watch was Swiss, worth more than most people's cars. He was 42 years old, handsome in the way money often made men handsome, with sharp features and silver beginning to thread through dark hair. He looked successful because he was successful. He looked confident because he'd learned long ago that confidence was just fear with better posture. But today, looking at the crowd of candidates gathered outside his newest store, Alexander felt neither successful nor confident. He felt tired. He felt guilty. He felt like a man playing at goodness while running from his sins. His assistant, Jennifer, emerged from the passenger seat with her ever-present tablet, already rattling off the schedule. 32 candidates for the department manager position. All highly qualified. All eager. The interviews would run until 6 this evening, with him personally conducting the final rounds. They needed someone exceptional, someone who understood both the business side and the community aspect, someone who could make this store more than just another place to spend money. Alexander nodded without really listening. His eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the designer suits and practiced smiles, the kind of candidates he'd seen 1,000 times before. Competent probably, ambitious certainly, but there was a sameness to them that made his chest tighten, a uniformity that reminded him of everything he'd been trying to escape when he designed this project. And then he saw her. At first, Alexander thought she was someone's child, dropped off too early by a parent who didn't realize the interviews hadn't started yet. But no adult stood nearby. No hand rested protectively on her shoulder. She sat alone in the corner, a small figure in a faded purple jacket, her head bowed over something in her lap. Everything about her was wrong for this scene, her clothes, her age, her posture that spoke of exhaustion no 8-year-old should know. Something cold slithered down Alexander's spine. Jennifer was still talking, something about the interview schedule and the evaluation rubric, but Alexander had stopped listening entirely. He watched the little girl, watched how she held whatever was in her lap like it was precious, watched how she kept her head down even as the other candidates began to notice his arrival, began to straighten and smile and position themselves for his attention. This child wasn't positioning herself for anything. She was trying to disappear. Alexander had grown up poor. Not quite this poor maybe, but close enough to recognize the signs. The too small shoes. The patched jacket. The careful stillness that came from learning early that drawing attention usually meant trouble. His mother had raised him alone after his father walked out, worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed, sacrificed everything so Alexander could be the first in their family to go to college. He'd built his fortune on her sacrifice, on the memory of her hands cracked and bleeding from cleaning other people's houses so he could have clean clothes for school. He'd promised himself he'd never forget where he came from, never forget what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be judged by your clothes instead of your character. And yet 3 nights ago, he'd let his driver run down a woman and keep driving because stopping was inconvenient. The shame of it burned in his throat like acid. Change of plans, Alexander said, cutting off Jennifer mid-sentence. We're opening early, and I'm interviewing that little girl first. Jennifer followed his gaze, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising toward her hairline. Sir, that's a child. She's not. I mean, she can't possibly be here for the interviews. Then we'll find out why she is here, Alexander said, his voice quiet but firm. Open the doors, Jennifer, and someone bring her inside. Gently. If his staff thought he'd lost his mind, they had the grace not to say so. Perhaps they recognized something in his tone, some quality that said this wasn't a request or a whim but something closer to desperation. Perhaps they simply knew better than to argue when Alexander Churchill made a decision. The doors unlocked with a soft click that sounded, in that moment, like the beginning of everything. Alexander's office occupied the entire top floor of the building, a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, steel and glass towers stretching toward a sky that was just beginning to lose its morning colors. The desk was mahogany, custom-made, large enough to make visitors feel small. The chairs were Italian leather, the artwork on the walls original pieces from artists whose names carried weight in galleries from New York to London. It was meant to be a throne room for capitalism, a space that announced success before a single word was spoken. Alice looked impossibly tiny in one of the leather chairs. Her feet dangled inches above the floor, swinging slightly with nervous energy. She'd placed the envelope on the desk with both hands, carefully, as if it were made of glass instead of paper. Her eyes were wide as she took in the office, darting from the windows to the artwork to the massive desk, trying to process a level of wealth she'd only imagined in movies. Alexander sat across from her, and for the first time in his professional life, felt completely uncertain about how to begin. He'd interviewed hundreds of candidates over the years, knew all the right questions, the psychological tricks to reveal character and competence. But those techniques felt obscene here, looking at a child who should have been in school, not sitting in a millionaire's office clutching an envelope like a lifeline. "What's your name?" Alexander asked finally, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Alice Turner, sir." Her voice was small but clear, carrying the careful enunciation of a child who'd been taught that manners mattered even when nothing else did. "Alice. That's a beautiful name." Alexander leaned back slightly, trying to make himself less imposing, though he suspected that in this office, in this suit, surrounded by this wealth, there was no way to appear anything other than exactly what he was. "Can you tell me why you're here, Alice?" Alice's hands twisted in her lap, fingers knotting together. "My mama can't come, sir. She wanted to so bad, but she can't walk right now. So I came instead, to give you her application, to tell you that she's the best worker you could ever hire and that she really, really needs this job." Something in Alexander's chest cracked. "Why can't your mama walk, Alice?" The little girl's eyes dropped to her lap. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, tighter, fighting against tears that Alexander could see gathering at the corners of her eyes. "She got hit by a car, sir. 3 nights ago. She was walking home from work because she didn't have bus money because she bought my lunch food instead. And a car hit her at the crosswalk and just kept going. Didn't even stop." The words landed like physical blows. 3 nights ago. Walking home from work. Hit by a car that didn't stop. Alexander's mouth went dry. His hands, resting on the desk, began to tremble. He pressed them flat against the mahogany, fighting to keep his expression neutral, fighting against the scream building in his throat. What kind of car was it, Alice?" The question came out rougher than he'd intended, almost desperate. Alice looked up, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "I don't know cars, sir. But it was big and black and shiny. Really, really shiny. Mr. Johnson said it was the kind of car rich people drive. Said whoever was in it should be ashamed, leaving my mama like that." The office walls seemed to be closing in. Alexander's vision tunneled, the edges going dark, his breathing shallow. Black and shiny. The kind of car rich people drive. His car. His driver. His guilt made flesh in the form of an 8-year-old girl who had no idea she was sitting across from the man responsible for her mother's pain. "Is your mama okay?" The question was barely a whisper. Alice shook her head, and the tears she'd been fighting finally spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silent streams. "No, sir. She's getting worse. The medicine lady tried to help, but Mama needs a real doctor, and we don't have money for that. Her leg is really bad, and she has a fever, and this morning she didn't even know who I was. She kept calling me Sarah, but that was my grandmother's name, and she's been dead since before I was born." Each word was a knife. Each detail a confirmation of the nightmare Alexander had been trying to ignore for 3 days. This wasn't some abstract victim who'd probably been fine. This was Mary Turner, a woman who'd sacrificed her bus fare to feed her daughter, a woman who was now lying somewhere with an infected wound and a fever high enough to cause delirium, a woman who might die because Alexander Churchill had been too much of a coward to stop. Stories like this one remind us why we share these moments, why we document the intersections where lives collide and change forever. If you're finding something meaningful in Alice's courage, in her love for her mother, consider subscribing so you never miss these stories that restore our faith in second chances. Because what happens next in this office will challenge everything we think we know about guilt, redemption, and the courage it takes to make things right. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping back with a harsh sound that made Alice flinch. He walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface. Behind him, he could hear Alice's quiet sniffles, the rustle of fabric as she probably wiped her tears on her sleeve because she didn't have a tissue and was too proud to ask for one. "Where is your mama now, Alice?" Alexander's voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. "At home, sir. In our apartment. It's not far from here, maybe a 30-minute walk. Mrs. Chun from the medicine shop checks on her when I'm not there, and Mr. Johnson brings her water. But they're old and they can't help much, and I know Mama's really sick even though she tries to pretend she's not because she doesn't want me to worry." 30 minutes walking, which meant Alice had left her sick, possibly dying mother alone to come here. Had walked half an hour to deliver an application, to beg for a job on behalf of a woman who probably needed an emergency room more than employment. The weight of it pressed on Alexander's chest like a boulder. This child shouldn't be here. She should be in school, worrying about homework and friends and all the normal concerns of childhood. Instead, she was sitting in a millionaire's office trying to save her mother's life with nothing but a handwritten application and hope. Alexander had spent 20 years building an empire, had hundreds of employees, thousands of customers, millions of dollars in assets. He had power and influence and connections that stretched across the country. He was a man who made things happen with a single phone call. And 3 nights ago, he'd used all that power and privilege to run away from a woman bleeding on the street. No more. Alexander turned from the window, his decision made with the kind of clarity that came from absolute moral certainty. "Alice, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to help your mama. I'm going to make sure she gets the best medical care available, that her leg is treated properly, that she recovers completely. And she's going to get this job, not because you came here today, but because anyone who raised a daughter as brave as you must be exactly the kind of person I need running this store." Alice's eyes went wide, hope and disbelief warring on her small face. "Really, sir? You mean it?" "I mean it," Alexander said, and felt something shift inside him, some locked door finally opening. "But first, you need to take me to your mama. Right now. Can you do that?" Alice was already out of the chair, envelope forgotten on the desk, her face transformed by a smile so bright it hurt to look at. "Yes, sir. Thank you so much." As Alexander grabbed his coat and barked orders at Jennifer to cancel everything, to call his personal physician, to get the car ready immediately, he felt the full weight of his guilt settling on his shoulders. He was about to come face to face with the woman his driver had hit, the woman he'd left behind, the woman whose suffering he could have prevented with a single phone call 3 nights ago. He had no idea what he was going to say to her. No idea how to explain or apologize or make right something so fundamentally wrong. But he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to try. That he was going to use every resource at his disposal to save Mary Turner's life and give her daughter back the future she deserved. It was the least he could do, and possibly the most important thing he would ever do. The drive took 12 minutes by car, 12 minutes through a geography of inequality that made Alexander's stomach churn. They passed from the gleaming downtown district with its pristine sidewalks and carefully maintained landscaping into neighborhoods where the pavement cracked like drought-dried earth, where buildings wore their decay like a badge of endurance, where the very air seemed heavier with the weight of dreams deferred. Alice sat in the back seat beside him, her small body vibrating with nervous energy, hope and fear mixing in her expression every time she glanced at him to confirm he was really there, really coming, really going to help. She directed the driver with the confidence of someone who'd walked these streets 1,000 times, turn left at the bodega with the faded awning, right at the church with the broken steeple, straight past the park where the swings had been removed but the rusty frames remained like skeletal warnings. Jennifer sat in the front passenger seat, her phone pressed to her ear, executing Alexander's orders with the efficiency that had made her invaluable. Dr. Reginald Hayes, Alexander's personal physician, was already en route. An ambulance was on standby. She was coordinating with the best hospital in the city, ensuring a private room would be ready, that the best orthopedic surgeon was being called in, that money would be no object in Mary Turner's treatment. But even as Jennifer worked her organizational magic, even as Alexander marshaled all his resources towards salvation, a harder task awaited. He'd called Marcus, his former driver, an hour ago. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but had confirmed everything Alexander feared. Marcus had cried on the phone, great gulping sobs that spoke of 3 days carrying his own unbearable weight. Yes, he'd hit a woman. Yes, he'd panicked. Yes, he'd seen her fall and known it was bad and convinced himself that stopping would ruin everything, that rich men like Alexander Churchill didn't survive scandals like hit and runs, that prison waited for drivers who made mistakes. He'd checked the news obsessively for 3 days, terrified he'd see a death reported, equally terrified he wouldn't because that would mean she was suffering somewhere beyond help. Alexander had listened to the confession with a strange calm, the kind that came from knowing he was equally guilty, maybe more so because he'd had the power to stop it and hadn't. He'd told Marcus that they would deal with the legal consequences together, that he wouldn't let his former driver carry this alone. But first they had to make it right. Here, Alice said suddenly, pointing to a building that looked like it was held together by prayers and stubbornness. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. Alexander's building had a doorman, a concierge, and an elevator lined with mirrors and mahogany. This building had a broken front door that hung on one hinge and a stairwell that smelled of old food and older despair. The walls were water-stained, their original color lost to decades of neglect. Somewhere above them, a baby cried. Somewhere below, a television blared through 2 thin walls. This was where people lived when the system had given up on them, when poverty wasn't a temporary setback but a life sentence. They climbed the 3 flights, Alice leading, Alexander behind her, Jennifer following with her phone still pressed to her ear giving updates to the medical team. The stairs creaked ominously under their weight. A light fixture flickered, casting everything in a strobe effect that made the climb feel surreal, dreamlike, nightmarish. On the 2nd floor landing, they passed an old man struggling with a bag of groceries. He looked up as they passed, his eyes taking in Alexander's expensive suit, Jennifer's designer shoes, the incongruity of wealth in this place where wealth never ventured. His gaze settled on Alice, and his weathered face softened. "Alice, girl," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Your mama okay?" "Mr. Johnson." Alice's face lit up. "This is the man from the job. He's going to help Mama." Mr. Johnson straightened, setting down his groceries, his eyes narrowing as he studied Alexander with the kind of assessment that came from a lifetime reading people. "That right?" he said slowly. "You the one hiring?" "I'm the one who's going to make sure Mary Turner gets the help she needs," Alexander said, meeting the old man's gaze directly. "Are you the one who helped her the night she was hit?" Something flickered in Mr. Johnson's eyes, surprise maybe, or recognition. "I am. Found her in the street, bleeding and crying. Whoever hit her drove off like she was nothing. Like her life didn't matter." There was accusation in his tone, directed not at Alexander specifically but at the kind of person who would do such a thing, the kind of person who drove expensive cars and treated human beings like obstacles. If only Mr. Johnson knew how precise his accusation was. "Her life matters," Alexander said quietly, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm going to prove that to her and to her daughter. And to myself." Mr. Johnson held his gaze for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "3rd floor, last door on the left. Mrs. Chen's been doing what she can, but that girl needs a hospital. Has for 2 days now." They continued up, and with each step, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility settling deeper into his bones. This wasn't about charity or good publicity or even legal liability anymore. This was about a fundamental moral reckoning, about whether Alexander Churchill was the man he pretended to be or just another rich person who believed his money exempted him from basic human decency. Alice stopped in front of a door with faded paint and a broken peephole. She pulled out a key on a string around her neck and unlocked it with practiced ease. The door swung open into an apartment that was barely larger than Alexander's walk-in closet. One room served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. A hot plate on a small counter. A mini fridge that hummed loudly. A table with two mismatched chairs. A mattress on the floor in the corner, and on that mattress, covered with a thin blanket that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent, lay Mary Turner. Even from the doorway, Alexander could see she was in bad shape. Her skin had the grayish pallor of someone fighting a serious infection. Her breathing was labored, each exhale a small struggle. The blanket couldn't quite hide the bulk of bandages on her left leg, or the way she held that leg at an odd angle, as if any other position brought unbearable pain. An elderly Asian woman sat beside her, pressing a damp cloth to Mary's forehead. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening at the sight of Alexander's expensive suit in this place where expensive things never came. "Alice, bring help?" Mrs. Chen's English was accented but clear, her expression hopeful and cautious in equal measure. "Yes," Alice said, rushing to her mother's side. "Mama? Mama, wake up. The job man is here. He's going to help us." Mary's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and fever-bright. They wandered across the ceiling, around the room, past Alexander without recognition. "Sarah," she whispered. "Mama, is that you?" Alexander felt his knees go weak. He'd seen suffering before, had written checks to charities that dealt with it in abstract terms, numbers on reports, statistics in presentations. But this was real in a way that made every other experience feel like play acting. This woman was dying in a one-room apartment because his driver had hit her and he'd been too afraid to face the consequences. "Dr. Hayes is 2 minutes away," Jennifer said from behind him, her voice tight with emotion. Even she, who'd seen Alexander navigate countless business crises with ice-cold efficiency, seemed shaken by the reality of poverty and suffering in such close proximity. Alexander stepped forward, knelt beside the mattress, and for the first time in 3 days, looked directly at the human cost of his cowardice. Mary's eyes found him then, and though they were clouded with fever, something in them registered his presence. "Who?" she started to ask, but the effort was too much and the question dissolved into a cough that shook her whole body. "I'm here to help," Alexander said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I'm going to make this right, Mary. I promise you, I'm going to make this right." He had no idea if she heard him, no idea if she understood, but he made the promise anyway, to her, to Alice, to the universe, to whatever might be listening. And for the first time in 3 days, Alexander Churchill began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could become the man he'd always pretended to be. Dr. Reginald Hayes arrived like a force of nature, sweeping into the tiny apartment with his medical bag and an authority that came from 30 years of emergency medicine. He was Alexander's personal physician, a man accustomed to treating minor ailments in penthouse offices and prescribing antibiotics for colds that stressed executives convinced were pneumonia. But before he'd become a concierge doctor to the wealthy, Reginald Hayes had spent 10 years in the ER at County Hospital, had seen gunshot wounds and overdoses and the 1,000 ways poverty killed people slowly and quickly. One look at Mary Turner and his professional demeanor hardened into something grimmer. He knelt beside the mattress, his expensive slacks soaking up whatever moisture the thin fabric held, and began his examination with gentle but efficient hands. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Hayes asked, peeling back the bandages on Mary's leg. The smell that emerged made everyone in the room recoil, the unmistakable sweet rot stench of infected flesh. 3 days, Mrs. Chen said. She come to my shop that night, bleeding. I clean, I bandage, but I know it not enough. I tell her go hospital, but she say no money, no insurance. Dr. Hayes's jaw tightened. He probed the wound gently, and even in her fevered state, Mary moaned, her body trying to pull away from the pain. The flesh around the injury was swollen and discolored, angry red spreading out from the initial wound site like poison seeping through her system. He checked her pulse, her temperature, lifted her eyelids to examine her pupils. Cellulitis spreading to sepsis, he said finally, his voice professionally calm but his eyes meeting Alexander's with unmistakable urgency. Her temperature is 103. The infection has spread significantly. She needs 4 antibiotics immediately, surgical debridement of the wound, possibly amputation if the tissue death has progressed too far. She needs a hospital right now, not in 10 minutes now. The word amputation hit the room like a bomb. Alice made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Mrs. Chen's hand went to her mouth. Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him. No, he heard himself say. No amputation. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, you save her leg. You save her. Dr. Hayes nodded once, already pulling out his phone, barking orders about ambulances and surgical teams and/or prep. The tiny apartment exploded into controlled chaos. Paramedics arrived within minutes, guided up the narrow stairwell by Jennifer who'd gone down to meet them. They brought a stretcher, medical equipment, bags of 4 fluids, all the machinery of emergency medicine invading this space where usually nothing more advanced than store-bought bandages ever appeared. Neighbors had gathered in the doorway and spilled into the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Alexander could feel their eyes on him, assessing, judging, wondering what a man in a $3,000 suit was doing in their building, in Mary Turner's apartment. He could see the suspicion in their faces, the protective instinct that came from lives lived in a system that rarely sent help without strings attached. Mr. Johnson pushed through the crowd, his eyes going from Mary being loaded onto the stretcher to Alexander standing uselessly to the side. What's happening? Were they taking her? Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Hayes answered, adjusting the 4-line he'd already started in Mary's arm. She needs emergency surgery. Mercy General? Mr. Johnson's eyebrows rose. That's a private hospital. That place costs more per day than most people here make in a month. I'm paying, Alexander said simply. For everything. All of it. The declaration hung in the air. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. And why would you do that? You don't know Mary. Don't know Alice. Why would a man like you care about what happens to people like us? It was the question Alexander had been dreading, the one he knew he'd have to answer eventually. He looked at Alice, who stood pressed against Mrs. Chen's side, her eyes locked on her mother's unconscious face. He thought about the easy lie, about pretending this was simple charity or good business or anything other than what it really was. But Alice deserved better than lies. Mary deserved better than half-truths. Because I'm the reason she's like this, Alexander said, his voice low but clear enough that everyone in the room could hear. My driver hit her 3 nights ago, and I let him drive away. The confession landed like a physical blow. Mr. Johnson's face went hard. Mrs. Chen gasped. The neighbors' expressions shifted from suspicion to understanding to anger in the span of seconds. Someone in the hallway swore. Someone else said something about calling the police. But it was Alice's face that destroyed Alexander. The way her eyes went wide, then confused, then hurt, betrayal written in every line of her small features. She looked from him to her mother and back again, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to reconcile the man who'd promised to help with the man who'd caused all this suffering in the first place. You, she whispered, you hurt my mama? Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, though every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape the judgment in this 8-year-old's eyes. My driver did, and I let it happen. I let him keep driving because I was afraid of what stopping would mean for me, for my reputation, for my business. And that was wrong. That was unforgivably wrong. But I'm here now, Alice. I'm here and I'm going to make sure your mama gets better. I'm going to use everything I have to save her. I know that doesn't fix what I did. I know it doesn't make it right, but it's all I can offer. We're losing time, Dr. Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp. This conversation can happen later. Right now, this woman needs surgery or we're going to be having a very different conversation at her funeral. The brutal truth of it snapped everyone back to the immediate crisis. The paramedics began moving the stretcher toward the door. Dr. Hayes followed, still holding the 4-bag, still barking instructions into his phone. Jennifer was already ahead of them, clearing a path, making sure the way was open. Alice comes with me, Alexander said, reaching for the little girl's hand. She pulled back, her face a war between needing to be with her mother and hating the man who'd hurt her. Please, Alice. I know you don't trust me. I know I don't deserve your trust. But your mama needs you there when she wakes up. And I promise, I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to make sure she does wake up. Mrs. Chen gently pushed Alice forward. Go, child. Your mama needs you. We deal with everything else later. Alice allowed herself to be guided, but she didn't take Alexander's hand. She walked beside him but separate from him, and that small rejection hurt more than any words could have. They made their way down the narrow stairwell, the neighbors parting like a sea, their eyes following Alexander with expressions ranging from anger to disgust to something that might have been grudging respect for at least admitting his guilt. If you've ever witnessed a moment where someone had to face the consequences of their actions, where guilt became something tangible and unavoidable, you understand what was happening in that stairwell. These are the moments that define us, not our successes but how we handle our failures. We share these stories every week because they matter, because they show us that redemption isn't easy or pretty or simple. If this story is touching something in you, subscribe and join us in exploring what it means to be human, flawed, and trying. The ambulance waited outside, its lights painting the gray building in alternating shades of red and white. Mary was already inside. Dr. Hayes climbed in after her, his hands never stopping their efficient work. Alexander lifted Alice up, feeling how light she was, how easy it would be for the world to break someone so small, and yet how much strength lived in her fragile frame. He set her inside, then climbed in himself. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Alexander looked back at the building. Mr. Johnson stood on the steps, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Mrs. Chen waved at Alice, her expression sad but hopeful. A crowd of neighbors watched them go, and Alexander knew that by nightfall, everyone in that building, probably everyone in the neighborhood, would know what had happened. Would know that a rich man had hit one of their own and driven away. Would know that he'd finally come back. Would know that Mary Turner's fate now hung in the balance between infection and intervention, between the injury that had nearly killed her and the resources that might save her. The ambulance carved through traffic, other cars pulling aside to let them pass, and Alexander found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to since his mother died. Praying that Mary would survive. Praying that Alice would forgive him. Praying that he could somehow transform the worst thing he'd ever done into something that resembled redemption. Inside the ambulance, Mary's breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a small victory. Dr. Hayes worked with the calm intensity of someone who'd seen death too many times to be afraid of it but still fought against it with everything he had. Alice sat pressed into the corner, her eyes never leaving her mother's face, her small hands clasped together in her lap in what could have been prayer or hope or simply the grip of fear. and Alexander Churchill, millionaire, businessman, philanthropist, sat across from them, facing the wreckage of his cowardice and the slim chance at redemption that lay ahead. The hospital loomed in the distance, white walls and gleaming windows, a fortress of medicine and money where miracles happened daily for those who could afford them. Today, Alexander would make sure Mary Turner could afford one. The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours during which Alexander wore a path in the waiting room floor, during which Alice fell asleep on a vinyl couch with her head on Jennifer's lap, during which the sun crossed the sky and transformed the city from morning gold to afternoon shadows. Dr. Hayes had assembled a team, the best orthopedic surgeon in the state, an infectious disease specialist, nurses who moved with the choreographed efficiency of people who did this dance every day. They'd saved the leg. Barely. The surgeon, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, emerged exhausted and triumphant to deliver the news. The infection had been worse than they'd thought, had spread further, had come within hours of making amputation inevitable. But they'd caught it in time. Had cleaned out the dead tissue, irrigated the wound, started her on a cocktail of 4 antibiotics that would have bankrupted most families but that Alexander paid for without blinking. Mary Turner would walk again, would run if she wanted to, would dance at her daughter's wedding someday if she chose. But it would take time, weeks of recovery, physical therapy, follow-up surgeries to repair the damage more completely once the infection was cleared. Care that would require patience and resources and a level of medical attention most people only dreamed about. Alexander arranged it all. A private room on the top floor with a view of the park. Round-the-clock nursing care. The best physical therapists. He moved Alice into a suite in the luxury hotel next to the hospital, had Jennifer take her shopping for clothes that fit, for shoes that didn't hurt, for all the small dignities that poverty had stolen. He hired a tutor so Alice wouldn't fall behind in school. He made sure Mrs. Chen and Mr. Johnson were brought to visit, that Mary's few friends from her old job knew where she was and that they were welcome anytime. And every day, every single day, Alexander came to sit in Mary's room. At first, she was too weak to do much beyond sleep and wake and sleep again, the antibiotics and pain medications keeping her in a twilight state. But gradually, day by day, the fever broke. The gray pallor faded. The labored breathing eased. And one morning, 10 days after the surgery, Alexander arrived to find Mary Turner awake and aware and watching him with eyes that were clear and sharp and deeply, understandably angry. "You're the man who hit me," she said without preamble. Her voice was hoarse from disuse but steady. Alexander had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his head, had prepared speeches and apologies and explanations. But now, facing her direct gaze, all those words felt hollow. "Yes," he said simply. "My driver hit you. And I told him to keep driving." "Why?" The single word carried the weight of all her suffering, of 3 days lying in agony in a one-room apartment, of watching her daughter's fear, of knowing she might die and leave Alice alone in a world that had never been kind to them. "Because I was a coward," Alexander said. "Because I was more worried about bad publicity and legal problems than I was about your life. Because for just a moment, I was everything I've spent my life pretending not to be, selfish and callous and willing to sacrifice a stranger to protect myself. And I'm sorry. Those words aren't enough. I know they're not enough, but they're all I have." Mary was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying his face with an intensity that made Alexander feel transparent, as if she could see every ugly truth he'd ever tried to hide. Finally, she spoke again. "Alice tells me you've paid for everything. The surgery, the room, her hotel suite, all of it. It's the least I could do." "No," Mary said sharply. "The least you could do was stop that night. This is significantly more than the least." She shifted in bed, wincing despite the pain medication. "I don't know what you want from me. Forgiveness? Absolution? permission to feel like a good person again. I don't expect any of those things, Alexander said honestly. I don't deserve them. I needed to make sure you and Alice would be okay. That what I did wouldn't destroy your lives. Our lives were already pretty destroyed, Mary said, and there was no self-pity in her tone, just statement of fact. I was walking home from a job that barely paid rent, had just spent my last money on food for my daughter, was facing eviction and desperation and no way out. Your driver hitting me didn't destroy my life. It was already broken. You just made the breaking more obvious. The words stung because they were true. Alexander had lived in his bubble of wealth for so long he'd forgotten what it meant to struggle, to choose between medicine and food, between rent and electricity, to live in a system designed to keep people like Mary Turner trapped in poverty no matter how hard they worked. The job, Alexander said suddenly. The one you applied for. It's still yours if you want it. Once you're recovered, once you're ready, I'd like you to be the manager of the Churchill Community Store. And I'd like your input on expanding our community programs, hiring people from your neighborhood, creating opportunities for people who the system has failed. I'd like, if you're willing, to learn from you about what really matters. Mary laughed, a short, bitter sound. You want to ease your guilt by hiring me? Maybe, Alexander admitted. But also because Alice showed me your application. You're overqualified for the position. You have experience and skills that I need. And you understand something I've forgotten, what it means to work not for career advancement or wealth accumulation, but for survival, for your child, for dignity. I think you could teach me how to run a business that actually helps people instead of just extracting money from them. They talked for an hour that day. About Mary's work history, about her late husband, about raising Alice alone, about the thousand small humiliations of poverty. And Alexander listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. He heard about the jobs that paid minimum wage and expected maximum sacrifice. About the landlords who ignored broken heaters and mold but never missed a rent payment. About the schools where teachers were heroes but lacked resources. About a system that punished people for being poor and made escape nearly impossible. It was the beginning of something, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. A bridge beginning to form across the chasm of their different worlds. Over the following weeks, as Mary grew stronger, as she progressed from bed to wheelchair to walker to limping steps, the conversations continued. Alice was always there, doing homework in the corner, watching with sharp eyes as her mother and the man who'd hurt her slowly navigated towards something that resembled mutual respect. Alexander learned that Mary loved jazz, that she dreamed of being a singer before life and responsibility redirected her path. That she was funny, with a dry wit that could slice through pretension like a blade. That she was fiercely intelligent, her lack of formal education no barrier to a mind that analyzed problems with precision and creativity. And Mary learned that Alexander's wealth hadn't protected him from pain. That his mother's death 5 years ago had left him anchorless. That success had cost him relationships, family, connection. That he'd been playing a role for so long he'd forgotten who he really was beneath the suits and the reputation. You know people are going to think I'm with you for your money, Mary said one afternoon during physical therapy. She just completed a circuit of the room unassisted, and her face glowed with triumph and exhaustion. Are you? Alexander asked. With me, I mean? Mary met his eyes. I don't know yet. You hurt me, you've tried to make it right, and somewhere in between those two things, I've started to actually like you. Which is confusing and probably not smart and definitely not something I expected. I love you, Alexander said, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to say them. I know that's inappropriate and probably suspect given the circumstances, but it's true. I love your strength and your heart and the way you love Alice. I love how you see through all my carefully constructed facades. I love who I am when I'm with you, Someone real instead of someone performing reality. Mary was quiet for so long Alexander thought he'd ruined everything, pushed too hard, moved too fast, revealed too much. But then she smiled, small and tentative but genuine. "Ask me again when I can walk without limping," she said. "When the power dynamic is a little less skewed. When we've had time to figure out if this is real or just trauma bonding." "I can do that," Alexander said, and felt hope bloom in his chest like spring flowers after a long winter. 3 months later, in the same office where he'd first interviewed Alice, Alexander asked Mary Turner to marry him. Not with a grand gesture or an expensive ring, though both those things came eventually, but with a simple question about building a life together, raising Alice together, maybe changing small corners of the world together. Mary said yes. Not to wealth or rescue or escape from poverty, but to a man who'd shown her his worst self and then spent every day since trying to become his best self. To someone who'd hurt her and then healed her, not just her body but her faith in the possibility that people could change. The Churchill Community Department store opened 6 months after Mary's accident, 3 months after she'd officially taken her position as general manager. It wasn't the luxury boutique Alexander had originally envisioned, with price points designed to attract wealthy customers and margins that prioritized profit above all else. Instead, it had become something more complex and beautiful, a hybrid space that served the community while employing people from it. Mary had transformed Alexander's initial vision into something that actually worked. She'd hired from the neighborhood, giving chances to people with gaps in their resumes, with criminal records, with all the markers that usually meant automatic rejection. She'd implemented a sliding scale pricing system, controversial among Alexander's board members but revolutionary in practice, where customers paid what they could afford for essential items while luxury goods funded the difference. She'd created a childcare corner so parents could shop without stress. She'd partnered with local organizations to offer job training, financial literacy classes, health screenings. The store wasn't just a place to buy things. It had become a community hub, a source of pride, proof that business could serve people instead of extracting from them. And it was profitable. Not in the way Alexander's other ventures were profitable, not with margins that made shareholders salivate, but steadily and sustainably profitable in a way that could be replicated, scaled, transformed into a model for something larger. Mary had done that. Her vision, her leadership, her understanding of what people actually needed instead of what wealthy executives thought they needed. Alexander stood outside the store on a crisp spring evening, watching through the windows as Mary consulted with staff members, her limp now barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. She wore a simple dress, professional but not pretentious, and her hair was pulled back in a style that managed to be both practical and beautiful. She laughed at something one of the employees said, her whole face lighting up, and Alexander felt his heart constrict with the enormity of what he felt for this woman. Alice emerged from the store, backpack slung over one shoulder, her face breaking into a grin when she saw him. "Alex, you're early." Over the past months, Alice had slowly warmed to him. It hadn't been easy or quick. There had been days when she looked at him and clearly saw only the man who'd hurt her mother. But gradually, as Alexander showed up consistently, as he kept his promises, as he loved Mary not for what she could do for him but for who she was, Alice had begun to forgive. Had begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, this man who'd entered their lives in the worst possible way might turn out to be something like a father. "I wanted to pick you both up," Alexander said, ruffling her hair in a gesture that had become familiar. "How was tutoring?" "Good. I got an A on my math test." Alice's pride was evident, and it should be. She'd struggled at first, the gaps in her education from years in underfunded schools creating obstacles. But with consistent tutoring, with resources and support and encouragement, she'd begun to thrive. "That's wonderful," Alexander said and meant it. Alice's successes felt more meaningful to him than any business deal he'd ever closed. Mary emerged from the store, locking the door behind her, waving to employees heading home. She walked to where Alexander and Alice stood, and the three of them together felt like something whole, something that made sense in a way Alexander's life never had before. "Ready?" Mary asked, slipping her hand into Alexander's. The gesture was casual, comfortable, the kind of intimacy that came from months of building trust. They drove to a small Italian restaurant, nothing fancy, the kind of place where the owner knew your name and the pasta was made fresh daily. Over dinner, they talked about their days, about Alice's test, about a difficult customer Mary had dealt with, about Alexander's ongoing battle with his board over expanding the community store model. But Alexander was distracted, the ring in his pocket feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, had considered elaborate gestures and romantic settings, but in the end, he'd realized that Mary would appreciate simplicity more than spectacle. After dinner, they walked through a nearby park, the spring evening still holding enough light to paint everything in gold. Alice ran ahead, chasing pigeons with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd been given back her childhood. "Mary," Alexander said, stopping beside a fountain where water splashed musically over bronze figures. "Can I ask you something?" She turned to him, eyebrows raised, a smile playing at her lips. "That sounds ominously formal." "It is, I suppose." Alexander took a breath, feeling more nervous than he'd felt in any business negotiation, any public speech, any moment of his professional life. 6 months ago, I was a man who valued reputation over humanity, profit over people, comfort over courage. I was successful by every conventional measure and empty by every measure that actually mattered. And then your daughter walked into my office, and you came into my life, and everything changed. Mary's expression softened, her eyes bright with emotion. "You've taught me what it means to be strong when you have nothing to fall back on but yourself. What it means to love someone so completely you'd sacrifice everything for them. What it means to forgive when forgiveness seems impossible. And I know our beginning was about as wrong as beginnings can be. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be fully healed, but I'm asking anyway, hoping anyway." He pulled the ring from his pocket, a simple band with a single stone, nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed wealth. "Mary Turner, would you marry me? Would you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you've given me?" Around them, the world continued its evening routine, joggers passed, children played, the city hummed with its endless energy. But in that moment, beside that fountain, there existed only Mary and Alexander and the question hanging between them. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that full brilliant smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, and she laughed, pulling him close, kissing him with a joy that felt like absolution and promise and hope all mixed together. "Mama!" Alice's voice carried across the park. "Mama, are you crying? Why are you crying?" "Happy tears, baby," Mary called back. "Come here, we have news." Alice ran to them, and when they told her, when they explained that they were going to be a family, officially and permanently, her face cycled through surprise and consideration and then pure delight. "Does this mean Alex will be my dad?" she asked, looking between them. Alexander knelt down to her level. "Only if you want me to be. I know I can't replace your real father, wouldn't try to. But I'd be honored to be part of your family, to be there for you, to love you the way you deserve." Alice considered this seriously, as she considered everything, then nodded decisively. "But you have to promise to always tell the truth, even when it's hard. No more driving away from things." The condition hit Alexander right in the chest, a reminder of how they'd begun, of the trust he'd broken and spent months rebuilding. "I promise," he said. No more driving away. No matter how hard the truth is, I'll face it. We'll face it together. These moments, when broken people find ways to heal together, when guilt transforms into growth, when families form from unlikely beginnings, these are the stories that matter most. If this journey from tragedy to hope has moved you, if Mary's strength and Alice's resilience and Alexander's transformation have touched something in your heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe. Every week we bring you stories about real human struggles and triumphs, about second chances and the courage to take them. Join our community and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story means to you. Alice hugged them both, her small arms barely reaching around them, but holding on with all the fierce love in her small body. And standing there in the park as the sun set and the city lights began to glow, Alexander Churchill understood that he'd been searching his whole life for exactly this. Not success or wealth or recognition, but belonging. The simple, profound gift of being loved by people who knew the worst of him and chose him anyway. They married in the park where Alexander had proposed, on a Saturday morning when the spring flowers were blooming and the air smelled of possibility. It was a small ceremony, immediate family only, though Alexander's definition of family had expanded dramatically to include Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Chin, the neighbors from Mary's old building who'd become surrogate grandparents to Alice, the employees from the community store who'd become more than co-workers. Marcus attended too, at Alexander's insistence and Mary's surprising support. The former driver had faced legal consequences for the hit-and-run, community service and probation and a permanent mark on his record. But he'd also become one of the community store's most dedicated volunteers, working in the job training program, teaching auto mechanics to young people who needed marketable skills. His presence at the wedding was controversial, some guests uncomfortable with the visible reminder of how this all began. But Mary had insisted, had told Alexander that forgiveness meant including the full story, not just the parts that were comfortable. Alice served as flower girl, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, lavender with tiny white flowers, practical shoes instead of the delicate slippers that looked pretty but hurt after 10 minutes. She took her role seriously, scattering petals with careful precision, her face a portrait of concentration and joy. When Mary walked down the makeshift aisle, on Mr. Johnson's arm since her own father had died years ago, Alexander felt tears prick his eyes. She wore a simple white dress that complemented rather than overwhelmed, her hair loose around her shoulders, a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real in a way that made everything else in Alexander's life feel like shadows. The ceremony was brief, the vows personal rather than traditional. Alexander promised to see people before profit, to use his privilege for purpose, to face hard truths instead of running from them. Mary promised to challenge him when he slipped into old patterns, to remind him where they'd come from, to love him through his imperfections as long as he kept working to be better. And Alice, unprompted, stood between them and added her own promise, to be patient while they figured out this family thing, to speak up when something felt wrong, to love them both even when they messed up because everyone deserved second chances. There wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering. The reception was held at the community store, transformed for the occasion with strings of lights and tables borrowed from the neighborhood church. The food was potluck, dishes brought by community members representing dozens of cultures, cuisine as diverse as the neighborhood itself. There were speeches and toasts and laughter, the kind of celebration that came from genuine affection rather than social obligation. Mr. Johnson stood, his aged hands shaking slightly as he raised his glass. "I've lived in this neighborhood 60 years, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Seen it decline, seen businesses close, seen people give up hope. Never thought I'd see someone like him," he gestured to Alexander, "actually care about people like us. But love does strange things. Makes cowards brave and strangers family. So here's to Mary and Alexander and to Alice who brought them together. May their love continue to change lives. The toast was echoed, glasses clinking, voices rising in agreement. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to depart, Alexander stood with Mary on the store's small balcony, watching the neighborhood they'd both come to love. 6 months ago, this area had felt dangerous to him, foreign, a place his driver hurried through with locked doors. Now he knew names and stories. Knew which kids were struggling in school and which elderly folks needed help with groceries. Knew the rhythm and soul of a community that had welcomed him despite every reason not to. No regrets. Mary asked, leaning against him. About marrying you? Never, Alexander said. About how we got here. Every day. But I've learned that regret can be a teacher if you let it. It's taught me that the person I hurt can become the person I love. That guilt can transform into purpose. That the worst thing I ever did led to the best thing that ever happened to me. That's a convenient narrative, Mary said, but she was smiling. True though, Alexander said. You saved me, Mary. You and Alice. Saved me from becoming the kind of man who lives in luxury but dies alone, who has everything except what matters. Inside the store, through the windows, they could see Alice dancing with Mrs. Chin, both of them laughing, moving to music only they could hear. It was an image of pure joy, of a child who'd been given her life back, of a future that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. The community store model was expanding. Alexander had convinced his board, showing them not just the financial viability but the social impact, the way investing in communities created sustainable success. 3 new locations were planned for underserved neighborhoods across the city. Mary would oversee them all, transforming from someone the system had failed into someone who was rewriting the system's rules. Alice had a college fund now, something neither Mary nor Alexander's mother had ever had. She had stability, opportunity, dreams that extended beyond survival into possibility. And Alexander had a family, something his wealth had never been able to buy, something he'd almost lost the right to have through his own cowardice, something he'd been given anyway through grace he didn't deserve but would spend his life trying to earn. As the last guests left and they locked up the store, as they drove home together to the house Alexander had bought in Mary's old neighborhood because she refused to leave her community behind, as they tucked Alice into bed and listened to her prayers that now included thanks for second chances and new families, Alexander understood something fundamental about redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the harm hadn't happened. It was about facing what you'd done, accepting the consequences, and then doing the hard daily work of becoming better. It was about transforming guilt into action, shame into service, mistakes into meaning. The story that began with a little girl sitting alone outside a locked building, that continued through surgery and recovery and slowly built trust, that culminated in a wedding and a family and a changed life. This story wasn't really about Alexander Churchill at all. It was about Mary Turner's strength and Alice's courage and the way love could grow in the ruins of terrible choices if people were brave enough to tend it. Alexander had been given a gift he didn't deserve, the chance to turn his worst moment into his redemption. Not everyone got that chance. Not everyone took it when offered. But he had, and in doing so, had discovered that the most shocking endings often came from the courage to make things right, even when right seemed impossible. That sometimes the person you hurt becomes the person who saves you. That families could be built from broken pieces if you were willing to do the work of healing. And that was the real story, the one worth telling, the one worth remembering. The one that proved humanity still existed, even in a world that often seemed determined to crush it. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Has there been a moment in your life where a terrible beginning led to something beautiful? Have you ever had to forgive the unforgivable or been forgiven for something you thought was unforgivable? Share your story in the comments below. Let us know your location, your thoughts, your own experiences with second chances and redemption. These stories matter because they're not just about other people, they're about all of us trying to do better, be better, love better. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing, as we do, that every story has the power to change someone's life. Until tomorrow, take care and stay blessed.